Hello everyone, I'm back from my small break, taking care of life and all, but today is another Caro observation that I made in the past few weeks. It is interesting because the expert does not play the line like this, and I believe when we started out, we were taught to play after, let's say, pawn takes on e4 in this position, to play knight takes e4, and after bishop to f5 to play knight to g3, attacking the bishop back, and the bishop would drop back on the continued pawn to h4, and order knight to f3. However, in these past few weeks rather, there is a trend in the intermediate player to just play knight to c5, which is an interesting move because I've never seen this before. I never really cared about this. I knew this is a bad move, but I never really researched into it. Now the move right here is rather simple looking. It is, the knight on c5 attacking b7 square, very simple. Most of the players, if they don't want to lose the pawn on b7, he plays queen to c7, protecting the pawn on b7, developing the piece as well. This is nothing bad. But this is really impractical to play for black. White here has a response of bishop to d3. Now this forces the exchange of the bishop. Now I say forces of the exchange, but you might see you can retreat to e6, you can retreat to d7 all the way to c8, or you can retreat to g6. But none of these square is actually good. For example, bishop to c8, it's just undeveloping the bishop back to the first rank. To e6, you just risk doubling the pawn on e file. That's not cool. And if bishop to d7, simply you play knight to f3. This is actually just developing more piece to the center of the board. Well, if you look at black does not have the square on d7 for the knight. The square on a6 is suspicious because there are two pieces literally attacking it. Black can play something like pawn to b6, kicking the knight away, but very simply knight to e4. We can retreat to c3, we can retreat to g3, all options available. In the end of the day, we will have 3 pieces versus 2 pieces, and very hard development for black. This will be a quiet position that white really wants to thrive here. Now instead of all this diagonal, if you play bishop to g6, simply the same thing. We play knight to f3 first. We could, if you wanted to, exchange it off, bishop to g6 and knight to f3. In essence, white still has a fantastic development. Black can again play pawn to b6. Again, a move to talk about, attacking the knight on e4. But because the d3 square is so vacant, the knight can just come back to d3. Now look at these two knights go. Controlling the e5 square, there will be no e5 break that easily. White castles very quickly. We can also just castle on the queen side, or perhaps just keep the king on the center of the board. Play h4, h5 and so on. And that will still be good for white to go. The problem is more of the development from black. And so this is not really something that black should play here. If black actually plays bishop takes on d3, exchanging the bishop, then again d3 square is vacant, knight can come back. The same thing, knight to f3 next move. With the help of pawn to c4, the position will prove to be better for white. And this is something that you don't want to play in chess, is that you want to have a good position in the opening and not a bad position from the get-go. Again, just to showcase what black and white can do right here. For example, if black plays pawn to e6, needs to play this because he has to get the bishop out, he has to get the knight out, and castle on the king side. Well, here white can play bishop to f4 already, attacking queen. See how easy development is for white. It's knight on d3, protecting f4 square, knight to f3 very soon. Black has to move the queen or play bishop to d6 in this position, but certainly would lose some tempo because then after bishop takes on d6, queen takes d6. Well, first of all, this one is hanging. We can play queen to g4, attacking the pawn on g7. But even here, a simple knight to f3 will have sufficed to claim that your position is better developed than black's position, with the queen right here being the only piece that is developed for black. But yeah, queen to g4 is one move that can attack g7, pawn to g6 for example. Then surely we can play knight to f3 and castle on both sides. And so yeah, that is basically all the cons of playing knight to c5 and queen to c7 from black. And so the way to do it is not to play queen to c7 in this position. In fact, if we were to flip the board in a second, you will see that the way we want to do it is not to play slowly. Rather, we want to play pawn to e5 in the center of the board. We directly challenge it. But in turn, of course, we're just going to lose the pawn on b7. Now, just to be clear, if the pawn were to be taken on e5, then the queen will take on d1, and that will hang on c5. So I hope everybody saw that. But in any case, if knight takes b7, we can play queen to b6 simply. Now attacking the knight. The knight really doesn't have a good square to go, rather than back to c5. But here we have a couple of options. First, to play bishop takes on c5, trading off the bishop. And after the queen takes, you're not really up a pawn. Your position is not really better in a sense, but you're not worse either. Now you have two pieces developed out, but instead have to look at white's pieces now stuck on the first rank still, right? White can play bishop to d3, challenging the only few pieces that's developed for black, but I think you can perfectly climb something like pawn to e4 in this position. This is nice. And they play something like knight to f3 to simply attack the pawn, e5, plus developing a piece for a bit. Play bishop to e2 next move perhaps. Well, I suggest you do the same thing, something like knight to f6 perhaps. But then here we also have a hanging pawn on c2. So definitely we can take the pawn, bishop takes on c2. After queen to d2 for example, we simply move the bishop back, and now we're just up a pawn. Not to say the position is winning, we still have some weaknesses of our own. On c6, on a7, the piece is not developed yet. But it is something, it is a pawn to pocket for a while, and we have an equal pieces that's developed for both sides. And so yeah, there's nothing too bad right here, yeah? Now white can play bishop to d3, challenging to exchange off the bishop on f5, but then black can just decline the exchange, play pawn to e4. This is fine as well. While we'll have to move the bishop back to e2. However, we can just simply move knight to f6 and castle on the king's side, just developing like normal, yeah? The bishop to e3, let's say, the only forcing move to, let's say, kick the queen away from the dominating square on c5. We can move the queen to b4, that is with check. And the queen to d2, let's say, or pawn to c3. Pawn c3 is actually worst of the two, because then queen takes on b2. Well, that is a split pawn for white as well, and so we don't really feel that bad over here. Borderline, perhaps white is basically just losing. White here can play rook to b1, but then simply queen takes on c3, that's fine. So you can see that that's pretty bad. Queen to d2, queen takes b2, very, very possible as well. However, you might have noticed in this position, if the bishop and the queen is working together, bishop to d4 is a possible move. But that's probably just very easy, yeah? The queen can just move somewhere, let's say queen to a3. I mean, okay, in this position, you're still up a pawn, and yeah, you won't feel that bad. The double pawns here, you can protect quite nicely, quite easily. Knight to d7, queen to e7 next move. All in all, a fine position to play if you're that adventurous. You're winning a pawn as well, and so that couldn't be too bad. So yeah, that's knight to c5 and bishop takes on c5. The other options to play is to play with pawn takes d4. Now this cuts off the defense of the knight on c5, and so the knight probably has to move. Normally they move to d3. This is basically a bad move, because again, as we develop with knight to f6 and knight to f3, let's say, yeah, white still controls the e5 square, but that's less interesting to do so right now, because now we have like a full defense. Bishop to d6 one thing, knight to e5 is not so interesting normal. And don't forget, we proc our knight on d3 and f3 earlier to stop the e5 break. Now the pawn is already on d4. So yeah, you know, there's nothing that the knight can do on e5. Knight to e5, simply we chop it off and play queen to a5. Now forking the king and the knight. So that's no good to play for white. So say bishop to e2 played, we can practically just castle on the king side, castle on the king side. Rook e8, I still think that the position is better due to the fact that we can push the pawn to c5, the knight coming to d7, and development would have been easy for black to play. The double bishop pair here is actually controlling something as well, compared to the counterpart here for white. The move according to the engine is to play knight to a4, but none has played this yet according to my observation. Well, obviously because they are all intermediate players, but according to the engine, knight to a4 is the best, attacking the queen on b6, forcing it to move. And if the queen moves to c7, let's say, then we simply develop a bishop to d3, queen d3, whatnot. And the split pawns right here will prove to be very, very weak. So you want to gain that tempo. Again, this Caro Kann is when you don't want to really relinquish the tempo that you have gotten. Something like queen to a5 would have been better. You see, bishop to d2, that is really not the place that the bishop wants to go to. After all, that hangs the knight on c3. But say if the pawn were to come to c3 to block that check, now the queen is also protecting the knight on a4. We can in this position just play knight to f6. Again, he can't take the pawn because it's pinned. And if bishop to d2, so to set up a discovery with pawn takes on d4. Now we just play knight to e4. That's actually a very fine move. Firstly, if the pawn takes on d4, simply just knight takes on d2, and this one still hangs. And so this is no good for white to play. And so it's not like white is all scot-free if he plays this position or opening lines. He still has to be careful. One of which, if you place bishop to d2 kind of arbitrarily, then knight to e4, as we talk about, really takes away the possibility of him having, or her really, having the double bishop pair. So yeah, this is actually just pretty cool to play for white, but it's not really the best, so to speak. Yeah, so if black plays a perfect defense or an engine-proven line, probably black will struggle to find a place for the piece rather, and black will have ended up having that easy position to play. Now, sample lines for white, if not bishop to d2, will be something like knight to f3, again with bishop coming out to d3 or to e2. Of course, for obvious reason, bishop to d3 is not available anytime soon, because as you can imagine, if bishop to d3 is really played, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, the knight will have been lost on a4. That would be pitiful. Instead, what black wants to do is to play pawn takes on c3, because obviously it's attacked. You don't want to play pawn to c5 as well, because that's such a hassle to protect the pawn that is, going to be lost. And if you can imagine just a bit, let's just imagine that the king is not taken, yeah? And you take the pawn on d4, the pawn takes on d4, the pawn on d4, then for black will be an isolated pawn, and that will be extremely difficult to defend for blacks. And so rather than protecting that pawn is just going to be lost, simply take on c3, just releasing that pawn. And for that, we have a simple development, bishop to e7 and castle on the king's side. A more ambitious move, something like bishop to b4, also very possible. Now pinning down knight to the king with the pressure of the queen and bishop right here. Again, black will have proven to have a fantastic position to play. And so this is really the position that I want to talk about. I believe I don't have to go so far. Every move's unnatural, except for the fact that after knight to c5, a lot of players will just protect the pawn on b7 with queen to c7. But as you can see, and as you can probably relate, that the b pawn for white, well, for white here is actually the b2 pawn, for black is actually the b7 pawn, is usually poisoned. And so if you don't actually protect the pawn, that's actually okay. In this position, the best move to play is to play pawn to e5, and after knight takes b7 to play queen to b6, the knight is simply trapped and has to come back to c5 square, which is really just going to be lost next turn and help our development a bit. And if not that, I'll simply just take on d4. And so yeah, these are all basically the position that I want to talk about. Hopefully keep it short and sweet. Check out the other players already if you haven't, and please consider pressing like button if you find this entertaining, if you learned something very useful, and I'll see you in another video. Thanks for watching.